The function of art, I think, is always to liberate and transcend reality by the description of reality. In other words, part of the therapeutic value of poetry is if you can put despair, you can give it a face, and give it images and words, you've robbed it of a lot of its power. It's the role of art in part. They're enabling us to face symbolically whatever the hell is out there, to begin to put ourselves on the road of liberation.
So you're saying that the best poetry, regardless of what the topic is, whether it's being gay or an orgy or something very, very quotidian, as in a typical Carlos Williams poem, it has to somehow link itself to the transcendental, not in an artificial, so religiously conformist fashion, but at the visceral level.
Yeah, we're talking about levels of human consciousness, of that which art can evoke, that in effect raises us to a different level of awareness. And one doesn't have to resort to mystical or theological explanations of the process. It's pretty much been a universal element in art from the very beginning. To put it in kind of trite terms, it's all about heightened consciousness, about understanding at another level, a deeper level.
What's that famous Native American chant that you often quote? I find it really beautiful. Everything ends in beauty. All is beauty.
It's from the Navajo night chant. It's a healing ritual. And the word beauty is an evocation of actually more than just aesthetic beauty. It's the beauty of a restored universe, of a restored mind, of a world, made whole. Made whole by driving away the forces of darkness, disillusion, bringing back sanity, bringing back healing, not only a physical healing, but a spiritual healing. And at the end they intone the words, it ends in beauty, it ends in beauty, it ends in beauty, which is a nice poetic way of rendering it. But it really means it ends in wholeness, it ends in unity, it ends in transcendence. All of those things are involved. To the Navajo, the great transgression that could lead one to suspicion of being a witch is not to walk in beauty. And what is not walking in beauty means not living in harmony, in consideration for the rest of natural creation, one's fellow man, living modestly. But the words we would use, like humbly, don't quite fit it. It's a sense of harmony and wholeness, and then that is beauty. And if you think about it, that's a pretty good definition of beauty. It goes way beyond the kind of superficial aesthetics that the West often uses. Although I think it's also at the heart of some of the best theorizing about art and beauty. I think it's also true that the Navajo would not see that particular ritual, which is a sort of multimedia performance involving dance, song, poetry, and what have you. They wouldn't see it as a work of art because there's no sense of art as a separate category. It's an expression of life, it's an affirmation of life, it's a restoration of life. That's the important function of the night chant. It is performed over an ill patient who has given many sheep for its performance, but it has a healing capacity, a restoration of wholeness and sound mind that reaches way beyond the individual. It is in every sense a communal ceremony. I think a lot of cultures believe in the power of words, the power of poetry, to heighten spiritual consciousness, to evoke power. A lot of studies of comparative religion emphasize the importance of words.
In the beginning was the Word,
Yeah.
and the Word was God.
Yeah. Or go back much earlier, say to the Vedas, which would be recited in a somewhat anachronistic language that, to the listener, conveyed a power and a beauty. The problem of Christianity was the corruption of the idea of word into the idea of doctrine. The effort to strip everything down to certain essential intellectual propositions, a kind of literalness. As my friend Lee suggests in his letter, Protestants are particularly prone to that. But I think it's a general problem. It's part of the compartmentalization, fragmentation of culture that occurs in, well, the more complex economic orders, certainly a feature of capitalism.
So going back to the question of restoration, don't you think poetry could play a very humble, because the only way in which we can restore, let's say, the commons or this sense of alienation, because when we're talking about the work of art as a separate category that the Navajos did not really understand or did not even could imagine, it seems to me that separation of work of art comes from the basically division of labor, which is a kind of reductive way to talk about it. But so in order to restore this spirit, this aesthetic sensibility, it does also involve a kind of political dimension, does it not? Against, let's say, a struggle against alienated labor, restoration of the commons, to overcome the very contradictions we every day face in separating art from everyday life.
I think poets like Ginsberg and Norse, in their essential use of vernacular language, in their populism, are reviving an ancient use of poetry as a way of defining consciousness, articulating values, providing points of social cohesion. As much as I love, say, the poetry of Wallace Stevens, I can't imagine that kind of poetry serving much of a broader social purpose. Perhaps if you had a highly educated population that read that sort of poetry, it might have some good effect. Stevens at his best is pretty awesome, and I think his power comes from his capacity to, how shall I put this, deconstruct images and symbols from everyday life and find often startlingly jarring meanings. Some of his greatest poetry, there's an anti-dogmatism, a breaking down of categories, an affirmation of experience. Of course, Norse and Ginsberg don't do anything like that. I don't know where I'm going with this. I guess just to say I don't think we fully understand, at least I do not fully understand, all the potential power of poetry. But it's been a long part of the human experience, and I think it's a characteristic of authoritarian cultures, whether capitalist or communist, to essentially want to control it or kill it.